Hey, welcome to By the Fire. This is Dave, and before the story begins, I just wanted to talk to you for a second. So I'm going to be reading from my debut novel, A Desperate Soul, in just a minute. Just wanted to share a couple of cool things with you before the story begins. So, as I said, this is my debut novel, and so I made a promise to God when I began this writing journey. I think fully that He has called me to do this. So I made Him a promise that my first work I would give completely back to Him. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is any money I make from this podcast and or book sales of my debut novel, whenever it's finally published and I'm no longer a wannabe novelist, I'm going to give completely away to charity. Yeah, that's right, I'm not going to keep a dime of it. So, in case you're curious, the way this actually works out is any money that comes in, 25% of it would go to my local church. So if you're doing the math, that's more than a tithe, and so I think that counts as a tithe and an offering. 25% would then go also to world evangelism through my church's fellowship. That's to support the work of planting new missionaries all across the world. Another 25% would go to Operation Underground Railroad, which is a fantastic organization that rescues human trafficking victims. Last 25% would go to Voice of the Martyrs, which is an organization dedicated to serving the persecuted church all across the world. I'll have links to all of those in the show notes. Just want to say thanks again for listening to By the Fire. A Desperate Soul, a Biblical Fantasy by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Oh, dreadful is the check, intense the agony, when the ear begins to hear and the eye begins to see, when the pulse begins to throb, the brain to think again, the soul to feel the flesh, and the flesh to feel the chain. Emily Bronte, The Prisoner. Prologue. Dothan, Israel, 850 BC. He hadn't been able to get the writer out of his mind, and now he knew why. The prophet Elisha concluded his morning prayers, facing south toward Jerusalem, as was his custom. He then retired to his makeshift parlor. The multi-miracle-working prophet removed the mantle given to him by his teacher, the famous prophet Elijah, and set it reverently on his couch. He sat, reached for his water jug, and groaned upon finding it empty. As usual, Elisha's prayers were long, loud, and powerful, which always led to a dry palate. And, as usual, his prayers were a two-way conversation. But today, it was a tad different. Normally, the response he received from God during prayer dealt with a task, something he had to do for someone, a miracle or the like. Or it was a message he was to deliver to a particular person, a judgment or the like. Today, however, it was a stern warning, and it was personal. A rustle came from the next room. It startled him momentarily, but Elisha then remembered he had a new servant. He'd forgotten. Again. The servant was a young man whose name he hadn't learned yet. He paused. Then a thought occurred to him. "Oh, Nar," he called. Nar was not the young man's name, but rather a way of saying young man in Hebrew. After an audible groan, the 14-year-old appeared in the doorway. "Would you be so kind as to fetch me a cup of water from the well?" Elisha asked. Nar sighed, giving Elisha a look that said, "What? Too lazy to get it yourself, O great prophet?" Nevertheless, He nodded and disappeared to complete the menial task. Elisha watched the boy go and shook his head. Nar had come to work for Elisha 2 weeks ago, after his previous servant, Gehazi, had been fired. Elisha had high hopes for Gehazi. An apparent unbeliever, the old prophet mistakenly assumed that witnessing the plethora of miracles that God would do through his ministry would eventually convert the man. Instead, Gehazi's heart hardened with each miracle. He was ultimately exposed as a liar, a schemer, and worst of all, an unbeliever. It pained Elisha to let him go after so much personal investment. Perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment was watching the man transform into a leper before his very eyes. Still reeling from Gehazi's betrayal, Elisha hadn't gotten used to having an apprentice again. He remained reluctant to learn the young man's name. He wasn't sure how long Nar would last. The kid did what he was told, never without a full measure of bad attitude. On his first day of employment, Elisha sent him on a 4-day round-trip voyage to Samaria with a message for the king of Israel warning of Assyrian attack. The young man had obeyed, and the attack was thwarted. However, Nar made it clear upon his return that he was not happy about his first mission. Surprised at his insolence, Elisha decided to call him Nar until a suitable time. The kid was rough around the edges, clearly a non-believer, as Gehazi had been. Elisha wondered why there was an apparent dearth of believers in Israel of all places. Furthermore, why become an apprentice to a prophet if you don't even believe in God? "Lord, could you not have sent me one that at least believes you exist?" he'd lamented more than once since the boy's arrival. Though the Lord answered nearly all of Elisha's prayers, that one had evidently bounced off of heaven's gates. As the current leader of the prophets in Israel, Elisha believed his mission was not only to perform miracles, but also to train successors to his ministry. And what better way than having a disciple working hand in glove with him daily? That's what Elisha's master Elijah had done for him, after all. He didn't need an attendant to bring him food and water or wash his feet, although it was good for character building as necessary. At age 14, Nar was legally a man, according to Jewish law. But judging by his character, he was immature, still a boy in Elisha's opinion. The old prophet had his work cut out for him. His thoughts shifted back to the rider. A few nights ago, as he strolled in front of his house, Elisha thought he'd seen a lone horseman along the crest of the mountains at the northern edge of Dothan. Perhaps he'd imagined it. He was getting older, as his ever-receding hairline reminded him. If the rider was real, then it was a peculiar sight indeed. No one traveled alone, especially not through the mountains after dark. That was a death wish if there ever was one. Elisha had chalked it up to his overactive imagination. During this morning's prayers, however, the word of the Lord had confirmed that the rider had not been his imagination. It was a spy. An attack was coming. The Syrian army had surrounded the city overnight. Although the king of Syria had declared war on Israel, the army was not there to attack Israel, or even the city of Dothan. They were here for one man, Elisha. King Ben-Hadad II of Syria had been informed that it was none other than the prophet Elisha foiling his plans time and again. He'd warned the king of Israel of several impending Syrian attacks. Somehow the old prophet demonstrated an uncanny ability to know the Syrians' every move, as if he'd been eavesdropping in the king's bedchamber. Ben-Hadad had had enough. The pesky old Israeli prophet must die. Elisha heard the distant whinnying of horses and boisterous conversation outside. In his mind's eye he saw the mass of soldiers mustering into companies, preparing for an all-out assault on him. Yet, in what should have been a cause for hysteria, Elisha saw a fantastic opportunity to train his new apprentice. Sure, he'd been thirsty after his prayers, but he'd had an ulterior motive. By sending Nar out to fetch water, he would surely see the Syrian army. And, Elisha thought, he should be running back through the door right about... Nar charged through the door, shut it, and pressed his back against it, as if he could withstand the army with his effort. He stared into space, wide-eyed and hyperventilating. "What is the matter, Nar?" Elisha asked curiously. "You look as though you've seen the Syrian army outside." Nar's normally tan complexion had drained from his face. He was statuesque except for his heaving chest. His eyes shifted, staring curiously at Elisha as if to say, "You knew?" His mouth tried to form a word, but couldn't through his heavy breathing. Nar managed a gesture toward the nearby window. Elisha grinned in spite of himself and gracefully took Nar's cue. "Something outside for me to see?" Elisha asked. The prophet strolled to the window and peered outside for only a moment before clapping his hands. "Ah! They are here! Right on time! God is good!" Nar's eyes widened the more. "Excuse me, son," said Elisha, shooing the boy away from the door. "I am the one for whom they seek. Come, we must greet them." "We, master?" the boy managed. "Yes, we," the prophet replied, stepping through the door. He took 3 steps, stopped and turned, gazing at Nar. The boy stood in the doorway, trembling. Elisha beckoned, and Nar sheepishly obeyed. He followed Elisha nervously as they approached the road. When they came to the highway, Nar stopped, taking in the eerily breathtaking sight of enemy soldiers in every direction. "Your last apprentice became a leper. Shall I become a prisoner? Or worse?" Nar squeaked. Elisha ignored him. No townspeople were out and about. The city should have been bustling with activity by this hour of the morning, but it looked abandoned. Everyone had barricaded themselves in their homes. All about them were anxious Syrian soldiers with shields borne, swords drawn. Behind the wall of thousands of soldiers were hundreds of chariots. Horses whinnied and reared up on their hind legs, eager to be let loose for a stampede. Elisha stepped onto the highway. Nar hung back 10 paces. The prophet glanced over his shoulder and motioned for the boy to join him. Nar reluctantly caught up to the old prophet. Elisha scanned the army until he found the man he was looking for. A confident grin crept across his face as he turned toward the captain of the Syrian army. The captain, an imposing man with olive skin and dark features, sat atop his horse at least 400 cubits, or 200 yards, away. The man busied himself authoritatively barking commands and gesturing at his lieutenants. One of his soldiers, standing close by, got the captain's attention, then pointed to Elisha and his servant. The captain looked at the old prophet in disbelief. He'd been prepared to pillage, plunder, and spoil every house in the city, searching for the prophet. Instead, the old man was coming to him? The captain drew his sword, pointed it skyward, and bellowed a command in the Syrian tongue. Like a tidal wave sweeping in two directions, soldiers on either side of him hoisted their swords. They let out a battle cry which quickly rose to a deafening magnitude. Nar covered his ears. Elisha did not. The captain lowered his sword until it pointed directly at the duo. The surrounding army began their march. Soldiers and chariots alike weaved through streets and houses, breaking pots, spilling water, and shoving animals aside. Women and children's screams sounded from inside the humble structures. In seconds, the army closed the gap from 400 cubits to 300. A cloud of dust arose behind the soldiers, partially obscuring the chariots. The earth under their feet vibrated with every step of the army's approach. Nar looked to Elisha, who grinned as if welcoming inevitable death. His smile grew wider with every step the army gained. "Alas, master!" the frantic apprentice cried. "What shall we do?" The boy half expected the prophet to ignore him, as he'd done moments ago. Instead, the old man turned, faced the boy, and took a step toward him. "Do not be afraid," Elisha said matter-of-factly. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Nar's jaw dropped. Any hope he'd had of an escape vanished. Now he knew the old man was insane. Those who are with us? The only ones with them were them. What in the world could he be talking about? Was the Israeli army hiding inside one of the houses? Or behind a bush? Or perhaps the loony old prophet assumed that the townspeople were going to come out of their houses and ambush the great Syrian army? Not likely. Even if they did, there were far more Syrian soldiers than local residents. Maybe the local livestock would assist in the resistance. He'd heard of donkeys that spoke back in the old days. Maybe they could fight too. The captain saw Elisha take a step toward Nar. Mistaking the gesture to mean that they intended to run, he wasn't taking any chances. This was by far the easiest assignment he'd ever received from King Ben-Hadad. The odds were clearly in his favor. 50,000 against 2. If he messed this up, he'd never hear the end of it. Actually, yes he would, because he'd be executed. The captain shouted the command to double-time their approach. In another few seconds, the gap closed to within 200 cubits. Nar could now see the expression on the captain's face. It was either determination or pure evil. Maybe both. Elisha suddenly stretched out an arm, spread his fingers, and laid his hand across Nar's face. The already nerve-racked boy recoiled as the man's fingers covered his eyelids. "Lord, open his eyes, that he might see," the prophet said. When Elisha removed his hand, shock swept over Nar. The Syrian army, now less than 50 yards away and closing fast, was completely surrounded by another army, one that Nar had somehow not noticed before, and one that the Syrians apparently didn't notice either. Atop the surrounding mountains stood tens of thousands of gigantic soldiers. Even so far away, Nar could tell that the soldiers were easily 6 cubits or 9 feet or more in height. Each held swords which glowed orange, as if freshly pulled from a blacksmith's furnace. Their armor and shields were golden. Their robes, girded at the waist, shone a radiant white. Interspersed among them were marvelous chariots, tethered to massive white horses. The chariots themselves appeared to be aflame, casting plumes of white smoke that vaporized like steam. His eyes swept the mountains, trying to count the chariots. He quickly gave up. By Nar's estimation, the Syrians were outnumbered 5-1. What are they? A heavenly army? The servant wondered. Surely this was what Elisha meant when he said, "Those with us are more than those with them." Now the old man's ridiculous grin made sense. But how did he know? There was still an obvious problem. The heavenly army was so far away. They stood atop the surrounding mountains, while the Syrians were practically in striking distance. No matter how glorious the otherworldly army appeared, what could they do from so far away? Then Nar noticed something else. A noise rising from the Syrian army, like a bear or a lion's growl. The noise grew both in volume and in frequency. Soon it sounded like thousands of animal growls, but he couldn't see where the noise was originating. Then another noise, a clinking noise. Chains? Nar squinted, scanning the Syrian army for the source of the sounds. They were so close. The cloud the army and chariots kicked up practically filled the valley. He could hardly see the front line of soldiers through the dust. But behind them, he looked harder. Were those giants? Descendants of Goliath? No, it couldn't be. It must be an illusion caused by the dust, he decided. He would have noticed them before. Then again, he hadn't seen the heavenly army on the mountains. Perhaps his eyes being opened meant he could also see another heavenly army accompanying the Syrians, only not exactly from heaven. A thought occurred to Nar. The dust! Of course! There was still time. Maybe they could escape in the... His thoughts were cut short when Elisha suddenly raised his arms. He looked toward the heavens and filled his lungs with air. "Strike this people, I pray, with blindness!" he thundered. Obeying as if he were their general, the heavenly soldiers, with their horses and chariots, alighted from the mountaintops. Though partially obscured by the dust, Nar watched as the brilliant horses effortlessly charged at 10 times the speed of any earthly animal down the steep hillsides. The giant soldiers leapt into the air, sprouted wings, and launched into the sky. Some had 2 wings, some had 6. They flew so fast that the air split into a deafening boom. He instinctively covered his ears. The flaming chariots caught up to the earthly chariots within seconds. The strange growling noises became louder and more boisterous, even frantic. The chain-clinking noise gave way to swords clanging. Nar saw hundreds of swinging orange beacons through the dust. Above them, thousands of angelic soldiers covered the sky like a great sheet, and then nosedived like falcons. They landed in a circle, forming a gold-and-white wall between the Syrian army and the humble duo. The next moment, in a flash brighter than lightning, the angels bolted outward, engaging the clueless Syrians. Nar shielded his eyes from both the intensity and the dust that now filled the air. Immediately, the sound of clanging swords and cries of confusion arose from the Syrians. The growling intensified to a fever pitch, and then ceased. The brightness waned a moment later. Nar uncovered his eyes. Thick dust swirled, filling his peripheral and invading his eyeballs. The boy blinked hard and coughed. He pulled his garment over his face and took a breath. Blinking several times to wash the dust out of his eyes, Nar noticed something out of place. The sound, or lack thereof. An eerie silence had fallen over the battlefield. It was several minutes before he finally heard someone speak, and when they did, it was in Syrian. Nar removed the garment from his face. To his astonishment, the heavenly army was gone. Only the Syrians remained. The soldiers stumbled about, bumping into each other. They tripped and cursed one another in their native tongue. Chariots were upended, having crashed into each other. Several Syrian horses lay on their sides, whinnying from injury. The captain pulled the reins on his horse and dismounted. He sheathed his sword and rubbed his eyes. He was mere feet from Elisha and Nar. Elisha approached him. "Captain, is everything all right?" he asked. The captain's hands flew to the hilt. "Who is there? Who are you?" the captain shouted in broken Hebrew. Elisha glanced at Nar, chuckling despite himself. "This is not the way, nor the city," Elisha said to the captain. The blinded captain's face screwed up. "The wrong city, but—" He trailed off. "Who are you? Why can I not see you?" "Come, I will bring you to the man whom you seek," Elisha said. The captain hesitated. "You know whom I seek?" he asked. "Yes, and where to find him," Elisha replied. The captain momentarily hesitated. Then, hearing the cries and curses of his men, while he considered his predicament, he acceded. An hour later, Elisha had painstakingly formed the entire blind army into a half-mile-long column. The men were so desperate to get their sight back that they were willing to listen to anyone who said they could help. The captain sat atop his horse. Elisha walked beside the steed, holding the reins. Nar walked next to Elisha. Elisha whispered instruction to the captain, who relayed it to his men, giving the appearance that the captain was still in charge, though the men could not see. "Let us go," Elisha whispered. The captain gave the order, and the army marched. "Where are we taking them?" Nar whispered. "Samaria," Elisha replied. "To the king?" Nar inquired, his eyes widening. Elisha nodded, smiling. They marched for a few minutes in relative silence. Then, Nar could no longer resist. "Master, did you know about the angels the whole time?" he asked. "Yes." "You saw them?" "No." Nar looked incredulous. "Then, how did you know they were there? And how did you know I would be able to see them? And how did you know they would obey your command?" The old prophet smiled. You have so much to learn. Faith, Nar, faith. Something my previous apprentice never learned, even after seeing many miracles." "Faith," Nar repeated, as if receiving an epiphany. Elisha sighed. "Perhaps that was the problem. Faith is not experienced with the eyes." "I see," Nar said, causing them both to chuckle. "By the way," Elisha said, "you never told me your name." "Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and
tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started.
Chapter 1. Virginia Beach, Virginia, 11 years ago. The cool autumn air washed across 7-year-old Jacob Jordan's smile as the horse-drawn wagon was towed along the earthen path. The smell of the cornfield, mixed with equine, had a distinction all its own. Hovering somehow just above it was the soft scent of his mother's perfume, a light, floral fragrance that she'd worn as far back as he could remember. He closed his eyes, taking it all in as the setting sun's final rays found their way through the surrounding corn stalks and onto his cheeks. His mother and father watched him intently, more pleased with the good time their son was having than the hayride itself. They warmly smiled at one another, both silently acknowledging that this moment would be one he'd always remember fondly. And so would they. The wagon rounded the final bend of the hayride. The driver yelled, "Whoa!" as he pulled back on the reins. The two steeds slowed and stopped at the same point where the ride began 30 minutes before. The driver dragged a set of wooden steps to the back of the wagon and unlatched the gate. 12 passengers exited in single file. "Did you have fun?" Jacob's father, Rick, asked. "Yeah, Daddy. That was so cool," Jacob replied. "I'm glad you liked it," Rick said with a laugh. Rick had an ever-friendly disposition, as if he was always on the verge of a laugh. Warmth was in his voice, whether he was speaking good news or bad, delivering encouragement or rebuke. It made him nearly impossible to read, but it was also hard not to like him. He was neither overly pacifistic nor annoyingly aggressive. He exuded just the right amount of masculinity, strong and even-tempered. It was what had first attracted Molly to him. Of course, his good looks helped. At only 32 years old, the already successful small business owner found that his soft-spoken optimism was what propelled things forward. As if it was contagious, he landed contract after contract, which, as an aftermarket firearm parts maker, was really saying something. Especially considering all the new regulations that seemed to spring up daily. Rick often joked that he wished he could make new parts half as fast as the government made new rules. Well known by local gun shop owners and the police department who'd procured some of his modifications, his office wall was plastered with letters of appreciation and photos with various celebrity gun enthusiasts. Despite his success, neither firearms nor his business were his top priority. "You know, this is one of the last hayrides that still uses horses," Jacob's mother, Molly, said. "Why?" Jacob asked. "Oh, I don't know. Probably because horses are expensive. Most hayrides nowadays use tractors," Molly said. "Tractors? Cool, I want to ride a tractor," Jacob cried. His father laughed. "You do you? Maybe next year, buddy." "Aw," Jacob moaned. "Hey, come on now," Rick said, wrapping an arm around his boy. "We got to get home, little guy. Grandma's going to be there soon." Grandma? Jacob asked. Yes, Grandma. Did you forget already? Rick said. Oh, yeah. You and Mommy are going on a date, right? Yep, that's right. I'm surprised you forgot, Molly said. You love when Grandma comes. Mm-hmm. Another cartoon and sugar extravaganza, I'm sure, said Rick. Oh, it's not that bad, Molly said, unconvincingly. Rick gave her a look that said, yeah, right. Okay, well, anyway, let's get home, Rick said. Can we get some hot cocoa on the way home? Jacob asked. What? Hot cocoa? Right before candy, cookies, Eskimo pies, and whatever other bribes Grandma brings with her? Please, Daddy. Please. Uh-oh, honey. The please has just made an appearance, Molly said. Oh, all right, Rick said. How can I say no to such good manners? Yes, Jacob fist-pumped. Excuse me. A soft, unfamiliar voice broke into the conversation. The three of them turned to see an elderly woman. Jacob remembered she'd been on the hayride with them. Yes, ma'am, said Rick, nodding cordially. Just wanted to tell you that you have a beautiful family, the woman said. Oh, thank you, Molly replied. Molly tucked one of her loose auburn curls behind her ear, which accentuated her light skin and crystal blue eyes. She was what the average man would call a ginger, and an immature man would call a hottie. Rick was far too classy to use either term. Instead, he called her Alain, the Gaelic word for beautiful. Unquestionably Irish, it tickled her soul that he would go to the trouble to learn and then use a word from her Celtic ancestry to describe her. Now 30, she'd been a catch when she'd captivated Rick almost 10 years ago. Rick maintained that it was her heart, not her beauty, that first captured him, but most people didn't buy that, not even Molly. And what a handsome young man you've got there, the elderly stranger said, motioning at young Jacob. Oh yeah, he's going to be a heartbreaker. Watch out, ladies, Rick said, chuckling. Well, thank you very much for the compliments, said Molly. And another one on the way, the lady asked, gesturing toward Molly's slightly protruding pregnant belly. Yep, a girl, Molly said, gently placing a hand on her stomach. Oh, how precious! How far along are you? 5.5 months. The lady smiled, then looked at Jacob. And what's your name, young man? She asked. Jacob looked bashfully at his parents, as if to ask permission to give the nice lady his name. Rick nodded his approval. Jacob, he said, blushing. Jacob. You know who he was? The lady inquired. Jacob turned and looked at his parents, confusion painted all over his face. You learned about him in Sunday school, Molly reminded him. Oh, said Jacob, suddenly remembering. He turned back to the elderly woman. You mean from the Bible? Yep, that's the one, the lady said. Uh-huh. He turned into Israel, Jacob answered, proud that he remembered the answer. That's right. Wow, smart one, isn't he? She said. Yes, he is. Sometimes too smart for his own good, said Rick, rustling Jacob's hair. You ready to be a big brother? The elderly lady asked. Jacob nodded, his eyes lighting up. He was not only ready, he was counting down the days. And I'm sure you're going to be a good one. Well, all right, I'll let y'all get on. Just remember one thing for me, Jacob. He raised his eyebrows in curiosity. 2 things you can learn from Jacob in the Bible. First, if God can change a man like Jacob into Israel, then he can change anyone. So there's always hope for us. No matter how bad things might look, remember that. Jacob understood, but was puzzled as to why the lady told him this. Rick and Molly simply smiled at one another. What's the other thing? Don't fight with God. He'll break your hip. Rick and Molly burst into laughter, after which the nice old lady then dismissed herself. She disappeared back into the farmhouse as the Jordan family got into their SUV. Tilda O'Brien, Jacob's grandmother, arrived just before 6 that evening, toting a grocery bag full of sugary goodies for her grandson, as expected. Jacob enthusiastically embraced his grandma, then snuck a peek into the bag. Tilda greeted her daughter Molly and her son-in-law Rick with a hug. "Thanks again, Mom," Molly said. "We won't be too late. Got church in the morning." "Oh, you guys take your time," Tilda said in her moderate Irish accent. "Jacob and I are going to throw a huge block party." Molly and Rick laughed. "Just kidding. We'll be fine. Have fun," Tilda said. "We owe you for this," said Rick. "Don't be silly. Getting to spend time with my grandson is the best payment for which I could hope." "Mm-hmm," Rick replied. "So how does a Starbucks gift card sound?" "Perfect!" They all shared a laugh. "So where are you two headed this time? Broadway, Martha's Vineyard, the Taj Mahal?" Tilda said. "All three," Rick joked. "No, not quite. There's a little place over on Virginia Beach Boulevard called Longhorn Ranch. You know how your daughter loves those Texas-style steakhouses?" "Oh, don't I know it," Tilda said. "Ever since she was little." "Hey, it's not me. It's the baby," Molly quipped, pointing at her belly. "She's demanding porterhouse steak, steamed asparagus, and garlic mashed potatoes. I mean, what do you want me to do? Tell her no? It'll break her little heart. She's too young to understand." They shared another laugh. "Well, don't let me hold you up. You two have a great date night," Tilda said. "You ready, Elaine?" Molly smiled, nodded, and called Jacob over to her. His parents each gave him a hug and a kiss, and told him how much they loved him. Rick tousled his hair, reminding him to be good for his grandma. Jacob assured him he would be. "I know you will, buddy. You're a great kid," Rick said. Rick and Molly climbed in the SUV and left for their date. Tilda and young Jacob watched them drive away, waving as they went. A strange feeling developed in the pit of Jacob's stomach. His countenance inexplicably changed ever so slightly. "You all right, Jacob?" Tilda asked, noticing. "Huh? Oh, yeah," he said. As Jacob's parents' SUV disappeared around the corner, Tilda asked him what he wanted to do first. He replied that he wanted to watch a movie, eat some popcorn and candy, and play some video games. "All at once?" she asked, surprised. He answered with a wide-eyed nod. My, she thought, what a night I'm in for. She didn't need to show Jacob how to work the TV. If anything, he'd have to school her on it. After all, she hadn't had a television in her house in years. But she did know that she'd have to get some dinner ready for him prior to any candy consumption. "How about this? I'll order a pizza while you play some games. Then, once the pizza comes, we'll pick out a movie, okay?" "Pizza? Yes!" he cried, pumping his fist in victory. As if she'd just made his whole year, she flipped open her newfangled cell phone thingy. She began busily tapping through the applications, trying to figure out how to look up a local pizza delivery place. She wasn't tech-savvy, after all. In fact, she'd never owned a computer. Trying to find a pizza place on her cell phone proved way too difficult. She ended up asking Jacob for help. He found one easily, using, of all things, a phone book. Jacob lay asleep on the floor atop his pillow and blanket 6 hours and a belly full of pizza, soda, candy, and chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream later. The DVD menu screen of the second Disney computer-animated movie of the night cycled as he softly snored. Tilda had dozed off, reading a book on the couch. She was awakened by a knock at the front door. She arose to answer it, groggily glancing at the clock on the wall. 1:14 a.m. That's strange, she thought. Who'd be knocking at this time of night? And where are Molly and Rick? She staggered to the door, turned on the porch light, and peered through the peephole. Who she saw surprised her. The police! Tilda opened the door, shielding her eyes from the porch light, while they adjusted. She vaguely made out the shapes of 3 officers, and asked them if everything was all right. "Ma'am, are you Tilda O'Brien?" one of the policemen said. "Yes." "I'm afraid you're going to have to come with us," the officer said. I don't understand. What's this about?" "Ma'am, like I said, you're going to need to come with us." "Officer, I have my grandson asleep in here. I can't just leave." "There's been an accident," the officer said. "Okay, what kind of—" She never finished the question. As her eyes adjusted, they focused on an emblem on one of the officers' uniforms. Police Chaplain. She quickly put 2 and 2 together. She gasped and put her hand to her mouth. "Are they okay? My daughter and my son-in-law!" "Ma'am, please, we really need you to come with us," the officer said. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Oh, no! Oh, God! No! God, please, no!" "Miss O'Brien," the police chaplain said, stepping forward. "We'll need you to come with us to the station. If you prefer, one of our officers can stay with your grandson, or we can wake him and he can come along. Either way, it's imperative that you come right away." Her eyes began to water uncontrollably, her heart pounding. Feeling herself begin to slip into hysteria, she struggled to gain control of her breathing, thoughts, and emotions. She lost. Tilda screamed, banging her hands on the front door. "Grandma?" She stopped, turning to see Jacob, standing next to her, rubbing his eyes. "Oh, child!" She knelt, embracing him and sobbing wildly. He clung to her, having no idea what was happening. Tilda agreed to go with the officers after a few more minutes of solid crying. She somehow carried the rather heavy Jacob with his blanket and pillow to the police cruiser. He slept the whole ride. She wished that it was all a dream. You've been listening to By the Fire. Hey, tell us what you think. Leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you download your podcasts. Or send me an email. info@davesmail.com. info@davesmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.